Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. On this edition of Think Tank, we go to the Harvard Business School to talk about the global business revolution. What does it mean, and what do the business revolutions of the past teach us about the present? Joining us is Assistant Professor Nancy Koehn, author of The Power of Commerce, Economy and Governance in the First British Empire. Professor Koehn is presently writing a book on the history of business revolutions. The world is in the midst of a third industrial revolution, or at least that is what they're teaching at the Harvard Business School. The first industrial revolution began in the late 1700s with the arrival of early factories, machine tools, and the first corporations. The second industrial revolution began in the 1840s and was triggered by the advent of the railroad, the telegraph, and later the internal combustion engine. With revolution comes opportunity. Andrew Carnegie built an empire based on steel. Jay Gould built a fortune out of railroads. John Rockefeller controlled the oil market. At the end of the 20th century, we are in a third industrial revolution born of rapid innovation in information processing and communications technologies. And once again, there are great opportunities as well as great risks. To prepare Harvard's business students for this fast-changing world, Professor Nancy Koehn invites them to study the past. Nancy Koehn of the Harvard Business School, welcome to Think Tank.
Thank you.
You are a business historian. You are writing a book, I understand, about the three industrial revolutions. What are they? There's an obvious question to start with.
Well, they are moments, I'd say succinctly, of overarching, defining economic change. The change is not necessarily confined to economics, but it's mostly, if history serves us well, driven by economic change, often with technological drivers, technological causes.
Okay, what's number one?
First one, Britain, 1760 to 1820, Manchester, the West Riding of Yorkshire, northwest England, the Silicon Valley of the 18th century. We're spinning textiles, mostly cotton, some metalware industry and manufacturing, which seems primitive by our standards, but would have been a quantum leap in productivity and in income, in the possibility of profits by the standards of the time. So the first one is Britain, late 18th century.
Is that driven by the steam engine?
Steam engine is important, but it doesn't really become, it's not the critical driver. The critical driver are things that seem so antiquated, seem quaint by our standards. The spinning jenny, Arkwright's water frame to weave more efficiently. The steam engine is important, but it isn't the thing that gets the revolution started. I mean, there are a whole host of interrelated factors, but the technology, again, by our standards, is primitive, and it's concerned primarily around spinning and weaving textiles, and to a certain extent around metalworking processes.
And theoretically, it flies under the flag of Adam Smith. I mean, he is. These are entrepreneurial activities in a fairly free environment.
They are, yes. They are entrepreneurial activities. The political environment is propitious, is nurturing of those things. But I'm not sure Smith himself would have waved the banner of progress around these things. I think the technological change he was just beginning to witness when he wrote Wealth of Nations, which is published in 1776, I think that technological change may even make him a bit nervous because it's such a significant change. Visually, economically, culturally, it's the birth of a management class in a very nebulous, small term kind of way. It's changing regional balances of power, right? Suddenly Manchester, Liverpool, the north of England is important. Agriculture continues to be the major source of wealth in England and of power, but suddenly there's emerging some cracks in that balance of power, this landscape of that power. And so I really think Smith was actually a bit nervous about what he saw.
Okay, what's phase two?
Second Industrial Revolution, less well known to students of elementary and high school history, is the period of time centered in the United States between roughly 1870 and 1920. This is called the second industrial revolution. It's, again, got technological drivers that are critical, the railroad and the telegraph, which link people and places and goods and businesses in new ways, and which create a national market for the first time. Because until you can move carpets and cows and iron bars around, you can't really have a national steel industry. And that, of course, requires some other technological innovations.
That drives national advertising.
And that drives National Biscuit Company. You need a biscuit, Nabisco. That drives national advertising. The first issue of Printer's Ink is the middle of the 1880s, and it's growing up in tandem with the rise of big business.
Printers Inc. being the trade magazine for the advertising trade.
The early trade magazine for the advertising industry. So this is the birth of Coca-Cola, of Sears Roebuck, of Montgomery Wards, of all the department stores.
Of catalog sales.
Of catalog sales, because you need a railroad before you can have the 19th century counterpart of electronic commerce. This is the birth of U.S. Steel, which grows out of Carnegie Steel. This is the birth of General Electric. 247 of last year's Fortune 500 companies are founded between 1880 and 1920. 247. So if we think a quarter is a long time, in the half-life of capitalism, imagine what that says about the window of opportunity at these moments of change.
But what is the third exclamation point?
I call it the third industrial revolution.
Right.
That's a historical bias. We could call it the information revolution. We could call it the communications revolution. We could call it the computer revolution. And we were doing that 2 years ago before the internet was on everyone's lips.
Right.
But it begins somewhere, I think, around 1970. One of my very esteemed colleagues, Al Chandler, dates it earlier. He says you can't understand the information revolution without understanding the transistor and a lot of different innovations that came out of the Second World War.
Radar.
Government-sponsored research.
Radar, that kind of stuff.
Radar. I've chosen 1970 because it seems to be a moment when a variety of stabilizing buttresses in global capitalism seem to give way. The American dominance, which has persisted in the global economy since 1945, is no longer a sort of postulate or first principle. The power of information technology is understood in terms of the mainframe. IBM comes out with its sort of paradigm-shifting System 360 in 1963, makes its first investments in that, and that's just beginning to be felt. By the mid-70s, there will be something called the Homebrew Computer Club, meeting in a classroom at Stanford University, full of a bunch of hobbyists saying there's something really neat going on in a personal computer. Apple will be found in that decade. Microsoft will be founded in 1978. I like to date it about 1970 because a bunch of different drivers seem to come together. There seems to be a concatenation of stuff happening that's interesting then.
Now, are we still in that third industrial revolution?
Most definitely. Most definitely. We are, I think, to go back to the second industrial revolution and use an analogy, we are in the very thick of it. And that's why, that's one of the reasons the stock market is so excited about technology and high technology. That's also one of the reasons the market is quite capricious, because the buttresses, the linchpins, the ballasts of the competitive order in high technology, and all the other firms that are affected by it, many of which are second industrial revolution firms, hasn't yet been established. Right? That ecosystem isn't yet stabilized in any real sense.
In the last 4 years in the global economy, the global gross domestic product has grown at a rate of 4% a year. In the previous 20 years, it's grown about 2% a year. Big argument going on. Is this just a normal up fluctuation? Or is this a new plateau in this third industrial revolution, golden age of the economy, all this technology? You are a historian, you ought to be able to look forward as well.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. That makes historians a bit nervous. Right. Let's just be truth in advertising.
You just talk and I'll call my broker. Okay, right, yeah.
I think it's directly a function of what's happening in this third industrial revolution.
So it might well continue at that higher level of growth.
It might well continue. If we look back at GNP numbers, which are loose and shaky in terms of how, because there is no Bureau of Labor Statistics, right. There is no Department of Commerce to collect those in the 18th and 19th centuries. But if we reconstruct those numbers as best we can, we see that these moments of change, these windows of opportunity, bring spikes, bring spikes in production. And over the long term, those spikes seem to lead to a rising increase in economic productivity and in growth. But are those spikes lead to a smooth path towards that? No. I mean, the late 19th century, the second industrial revolution, is fraught with peaks and valleys, as 4% or 6% gives way to 2% during significant business downturns. So is it likely that we're on autopilot or cruise control with 4%? I think not. Is it likely that this kind of technological change and the organizational innovations and product innovations and human resource innovations that can come out of this can drive long-term sustained increases in productivity? Yes, it is.
Let me suggest something else. If this revolution began in 1970, give or take a few years, if we had been sitting, and it's still going on, part and parcel of the same deal, if we had been sitting here in 1970 and I told you, Nancy, we are going to be within a decade or so, in for an era of global peace where democracy is riding the crest of the wave, where international trade is going to increase beyond our belief, where markets are going to be worshipped by all, including the communists in China. The fifth aspect would be technology, and we would agree that, yeah. Okay. Now, all those things happened, and not a whole lot of people were predicting them. Now, isn't it fair is it plausible then to say that the 1990s are the third and a half industrial revolution? I mean, isn't there a break in there somewhere around the mid-'80s or so where suddenly all of these vast structural changes have come about? More than just technology and chips and,
right.
I mean, the structure
Yep.
of all the things that you all at Harvard Business School and in the entrepreneurial capitals of the world have been saying, what we need are more property rights and market rights and laws and such and such and such and trade and democracy.
Absolutely, Ben. And we can maybe we should say that we're in the third industrial revolution, chapter 2, or chapter 3, or somewhere in the middle of the novel, getting close to a denouement. But it's much more. You're absolutely right. It's much more than just technology. I mean, the examples you gave are perfect examples of that. Globalization, this buzzword along with empowerment, one of the words of the 90s is linked to this technology. I mean, it's a lot easier for IBM to do business in China if they can connect to managers and markets and resource input supplies via the internet than it is if they don't have that kind of technology. But there's much more going on, right? There's this huge political issue, the 5 or 6 round bout between state-planned economies and capitalism that really ended in the late 80s, right? And capitalism won. Adam Smith, can roll over and rest easy in his grave. And that's a political issue as much as it's a technological issue. Just as the rise of organized labor, antitrust legislation, labor legislation that came out of that, the rise of the Federal Reserve System, those were political issues that came with the second industrial revolution. Till you have a factory, till you have mass numbers of people working in a factory, you don't really have organized labor. So I think it's chapter 3, and as you said, being driven by much more than technology. Politics, social issues, the power of communication to make one person or one brand a global brand very quickly, so that Michael Jordan is known around the world, as is Madonna. Mm-hmm. All those threads are interrelated in this very rich quilt, chaotic weave of the third industrial revolution. And they're going to give way, if history's any guide, they're going to give way to another very interesting quilt. And a few people, like your hypothetical conversants in 1970, are thinking about it very clearly. And if history is any guide, those are people like Josiah Wedgwood or John Rockefeller or Bill Gates in 1970 who saw that there was a market for software for this new strange machine called the personal computer.
Do you know of specific businessmen and businesswomen who avocationally really get off on studying business history of the sort that you commit?
Yes. I mean, that is anecdotally, talking to lots of business leaders, I can't tell you how responsive the court is. And a lot of it takes place around the enterprise of biography. And there's lots of interesting media statistics to tell us about how interested people are in biography. And we know the History Channel is very, very interested, is very, very compelling for people right now, at least if subscribers are any sign.
And that program Biography is
Henry
one of the great success stories in cable television, that particular series.
Exactly. And what business people tell me, and some of this is told through work I've done talking to alumni, and some of it is done through work I've done doing writing cases about specific businesses, and some of it just comes from speaking about business history to business leaders. And the immediate response is, wow, this looks a lot like something I'm dealing with now. What can I learn from the way Rockefellers thought about market share? Or what can I learn from the way Andrew Carnegie dealt with human resource management issues and the kind of trouble and confusion he suffered around some of those issues?
What's the answer? What can you learn? What can a businessman today, if he sat through your courses and learned about Carnegie and Rockefeller and Bill Gates and whoever, what should he know about what to do tomorrow from what happened yesterday?
Probably the most important lesson he can learn, and this is not something that I think is drummed into us in the pace and the challenge of everyday business life, is that you need to have a strategy and a structure for your organization that are mutually reinforcing. It's not enough to understand your strengths and weaknesses inside your company. You also have to understand what the opportunities and threats are on the outside.
Well, we don't let guests get away with strategy and structure. Okay. That's too arcane for you. You got to tell us what you're talking about. Yeah.
John Rockefeller decides that the name of the game, the way to make money in oil refining, this is before oil refining is an established business, before his companies will be some of the world leaders in the global oil business, decides that the way he has to make money in this particular business is to run his plants very full, to never let the refining fire go down. We have to run them absolutely full. We have to use every single bit of capital that we possibly can. This is not a labor-intensive business, oil refining. And once he understands that, then he understands that the fuller you can run your plants, it's not so dissimilar from making steel today or parts of the automobile manufacturing business. Once you run your plants absolutely full, you can drive price down very, very quickly.
You have more product to amortize out the capital costs of the investment.
Absolutely, and it's all high fixed costs. It's not marginal cost. So once you can do that, you can command incredibly important price advantages. Oil is not exactly like a double latte. It's much harder to brand than a tennis shoe or a specialty coffee drink. So price is the name of the game with the consumer. And he does a little bit of marketing, but it's primarily understanding that. Once he understands that, if he can get most of the capacity, if he can control a lot of the capacity, and 16 years after getting into the oil business, on a very, very part-time basis, he has 90% of the American oil refining capacity.
In effect, creating the antitrust laws.
The Sherman Antitrust Act passed in 1890. Antitrust. Why antitrust? Why not pro-competition, anti-monopoly? Because Standard Oil is structured as a trust. And it's the biggest game in town as far as big business. And that's why that is the genesis of or one of the very important catalysts to the Sherman Antitrust Act. So if your strategy is I want to own world markets, or I want to own a big chunk of the American market, and compare this to some of what Bill Gates, I think, saw very precociously with regard to operating system software, and then...
He's about as well-liked as John D. Rockefeller was.
There are remarkable similarities in the public's attitude towards both these business leaders and towards the size of the markets that they controlled. Centralized business power makes Americans nervous. Never mind that the economics of software production or oil refining may lead to efficient production with 1 or 2 or 3 producers only. Never mind that. I think there are a host of complicated reasons that make us nervous about centralized power. But once Rockefeller has his strategy, then he creates a structure. And his strategy is basically acquire capacity as efficiently as you can. He creates an organizational structure, a senior team of people, a kitchen cabinet, if you will, and he governs it with consensus. Very different kind of governing or management ethos to the one we believe prevails in Microsoft. So he understands that if he's brought in people into the oil industry, acquired their capacity. He needs to give them time to speak, time to air their views. And so he has a structure in place for gathering information about marketing, manufacturing, distribution that fits very nicely with what the strategy is. Aggrandize market share, run your plants full, keep the price low. That commands all kinds of other advantages upstream, right, with crude oil suppliers, and downstream with distributors if you're the biggest player in town. So if you ask me what do you really need to learn from history, and you see it so forcefully in history because you see people fumbling their way into victory or walking backward into the future, as one of my colleagues, Richard Tedlow, says. You see it so clearly in history. It's not enough to just have a strategy to win in the market. You have to have an internal structure that supports that. And you can't let your structure drive your strategy because capitalism waits for no man. The market waits for no one. The question is very important. What will the government's role be in an emerging set of industries in which there clearly are economies of scale and economies of scope? Economies of scale meaning add more inputs, get more output than the inputs you added. Double your inputs, get more than double outputs. Economies of scope in that if I produce a set of chemicals, I can also produce a kind of nylon very efficiently. If I produce Excel, I can also produce Word. If I produce Excel, I can also produce Encarta. So the short answer is I'm not exactly sure what the government will do. If we just take Microsoft for an example, the government is very avidly interested in most of the moves that company makes. And in the division of the government that's interested in that is the Department of Justice. It's the Antitrust Division. And there's a lot of pressure, political and competitive, on the Antitrust Division to make sure that Microsoft doesn't get too big and too powerful. Now, what do those words mean? Well, that's a very important question, and it's not clear exactly what those words mean for the Department of Justice or for Microsoft's competitors or for American voters.
Let's just close this off, not by talking about business, you're a business historian, but talking about history. The kind of history you do is not the history of kings, queens, presidents, wars. It is, to some extent, bottom-up history. And I wondered if you could explain this distinction to me. I know there's a big argument going on within the historical community, the academic community, as to whether you should be talking about the grand political decisions or about what people do, or perhaps somewhere in the middle about how businesses operate. I mean, the French historian, is it Braudel, is that his name?
Fernand Braudel.
Yeah, I mean, he is talking about how the peasants lived in the Middle Ages and how that drives the engine. I wondered if you could tell us where you stand on that and where business history fits into that model.
I think business history is a wonderful nexus or bridge between them. And that's why what we have here is so vital and really so rich. That is, I don't have to neglect wars or presidents or legislation or the personalities of workers or managers or lobbyists or consultants, because all of those things are within the purview of a single business leader, a single company. So for example, when we teach a case on organized labor here, we've got in the General Motors sit-down strike, which is an incredibly precocious snapshot of what was to come in American labor relations from the 30s on, all the way into our time. We don't just cover Alfred Sloan and his perspective on organized labor, right? We also think about what Frank Murphy, the governor of Michigan, was thinking about, and look at what individual workers were writing and talking about, because for that period we actually have film footage. So we are, it seems to me, the enterprise of business history is a way of speaking to the breadth, the broad landscape of change, in a way that doesn't suggest that any one group is somehow the most representative or the most important in understanding the past and how it describes and explains and adds up to who we are today and where we're going.
Okay. Thank you very much, Nancy Koehn of the Harvard Business School. And thank you for Think Tank. I'm Ben Wattenberg.
We at Think Tank depend on your views to make our show better. Please send your questions and comments to New River Media, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036. Or email us at thinktank@pbs.org. To learn more about Think Tank, visit PBS online at www.pbs.org. And please let us know where you watch Think Tank.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.